Welcome and thank you for being with us today. I'm Amjad Ahmed and I'm the chairman of the Atlantic Council's Empower Middle East initiative. Our initiative has aimed to explore opportunities and policies to improve the long-term prosperity of the Middle East. Regional economic cooperation and integration have been critical to catalyzing change to increase FDI, economic growth, and job creation across markets. We're excited to host this event to discuss our highly anticipated report, the Amman-Baghdad-Cairo Agreement, a new path for economic integration. The report assesses the outcomes of recent summits between Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan, focusing on trilateral agreements to deepen economic cooperation. The report represents possible pitfalls and potential benefits of strengthening economic ties between the three nations, with each country's perspective represented solely from the view of the respective author. By cooperating, the three countries can represent a united economic front with a collective of 150 million citizens, more than 550 billion in GDP, and access to major trade routes, markets, and economic and political relationships. The critical factor determining the success of the ABC agreement is whether it can bring tangible, practical benefits to the three participating countries. We are honored to have a distinguished panel featuring King & Spalding Senior Counsel Hamid Mamdouh and the three co-authors of the report: Atlantic Council's Empower Me Director, Rasha Helwa, Manasir Group's Vice Chairman, Ibrahim Saif, and Iraqi Economists Network founder and coordinator, Barak Shuber. Hamid Mamdouh is a senior counsel at King & Spalding and former director of the Trade and Services and Investment Division of the WTO. Before that, he was senior counselor in the Services Division and was the secretary of the WTA Council for Trade and Services since the establishment of the WTO in 1995. Rasha Helwa is the director of the Empower Middle East initiative at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. Rasha is a senior economist with 22 years of professional experience in economic and financial policy analysis and implementation. Ibrahim Saif is currently vice chairman of Manasir Group and a fellow with the Jordan Strategy Forum. Previously, he served as CEO of the Jordan Strategy Forum from 2019 to 2020. He has served as Jordan's Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources from March 2015 to June 2017, and the Minister of Planning and International Cooperation from March 2013 until March 2015. Barak Shuber is the founder and coordinator of the Iraqi Economists Network. He specializes in macroeconomic management and development planning, as well as sector analysis and project management. Welcome to the panel. I'll now invite each one of you to give brief remarks, beginning with Hamid. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation, first of all, and for the kind introduction as well. And I would start also by congratulating the Atlantic Council for an excellent report. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it and sort of brought a lot of ideas and a lot of reflections to my mind. Now, first of all, we're talking about the ABC agreement. It is actually something in the making. In other words, it is still work in progress, which means that this report is quite timely because it will feed into the thinking process that would help the three countries make certain choices. And there are choices to be made with respect to the scope of the agreement, the depth of the agreement, what it will cover, and so forth. There will be the long-term, short-term vision behind the agreement and all that. And this is actually why, as I said, this is very timely. And there is, of course, the perspective that this agreement can be and maybe should be the step towards a more futuristic vision about economic integration, which logically starts with focusing on trade. And if we look at historic experiences like the European Union, we all recall that the European Union started as a trade agreement. It was focused on trade, integrating into a common market, and then based on that, other aspects of economic integration developed. So this is this is actually a very, very interesting time, because it's important to feed ideas, analysis, and perspectives into the thinking process behind the political will that led to this great initiative. And I think when I was looking at the report, I think you're right. The report is right about the history of optimistic proclamations in countries of the region, because the goodwill is there and people's hearts and minds are in the right place, but they have not really materialized into tangible benefits, as you said in your introductory remarks, Amjad. Now, how do we make sure? How do we try to help ensure that it would be a bit different this time around? Now, we all know the geopolitical desirability that made this agreement a strategic objective for the three countries, but this is not our objective for the discussion today. And therefore, I would focus my remarks on three specific perspectives from which we should look at the agreement and its details, and then feed into the kind of choices I'm talking about. The first is the policy perspective. And here I have to clarify, I mean policy, not political. There's a difference, at least in my mind. By policy, I mean specific economic policies like trade policy, investment policy, industrial policy, and other economic policies. And the second perspective I would suggest is also the systemic perspective. And here there's, of course, when we say systemic, there is the multilateral and there's the regional perspective. I'll come to each of those in a minute. And then the third and final perspective is what I would call the transactional perspective. What these three countries can actually exchange. What can they buy and sell to each other today? And there, I think the report made an excellent job. So let me start with the first perspective, and that's the policy perspective. And what I mean here actually is to have a view about the coherence of this agreement as a project of cooperation between three countries. How coherent is it with their approach, with their, I would start with their economic identity. I would say the three of them actually are market economies. And how do you discern the economic identity? There are public expressions of political will. In Egypt, for example, you have the constitution, the Egyptian constitution, I think it's Article 27, that states clearly that Egypt is a market economy based on competitiveness. Now, you have a compass there with respect to the sense of direction. In the case of Iraq, we have the white paper, which was issued in October 2020. It was issued by what was called then the Emergency Cell for Financial Reform, which was chaired by the Iraqi Prime Minister. And it states the objectives of the economic reform strategy for Iraq, which is about creating competitive market, diversifying the economy, giving a leading role to the private sector, attracting foreign direct investment, and of course paying attention to the less fortunate segments of the society. Which together, put all this together, to me, this is also a definition of what a market economy looks like. Now, in the case of Jordan actually had a more consistent history of actually being a market economy. Jordan was fortunate not to face any of the kind of disruptive political experiences that Iraq and Egypt have faced recently. But Jordan is recognized by the World Bank and by other international organizations as an emerging market economy. By market economy here, I mean an economy where the allocation of resources take place based on the market forces as expressed in supply and demand. So we take the first box, perspective, policy perspective. Yes, there is coherence, and an agreement like this goes into the right direction for those three countries. The second, which is the systemic perspective, I think here, multilaterally, two of the three are actually members of the WTO. That's Jordan and Egypt. Iraq is currently negotiating its accession to the WTO. So obviously, an important factor here is that whatever agreement the three countries end up having, the ABC agreement, it would have to be consistent with the treaty obligations that the WTO provides, which is not really an insurmountable challenge, not at all. It just sets certain threshold of ambition for such regional agreements to achieve certain levels of liberalization. And when it comes to the regional perspective, well, the three countries are actually members and signatories of the GAFTA, which is the Greater Arab Free Trade Area Agreement. And there has been a long-standing effort of integrating Arab markets at the trade level, trade in goods and trade in services. Now, it is important here when we think systemically also that we keep in mind that when we talk about trade, we keep in mind the reality of world trade today, which is that we're not talking about just merchandise crossing borders. We're talking about trade in goods and trade in services. And trade in services is a much bigger story than trade in goods. Now, of course, you might turn around and say, oh, yes, of course, Hamid would say that. But actually, this is the reality of the global economy today. 70% of global GDP is in services. 2/3 of global FDI flows are in services. And services actually, for countries like Jordan and Egypt, represent 60% or more of their GDPs. I'm not quite sure about the latest figures for Iraq, but what it means, the reality is that the services sector in any economy is bigger than all other sectors combined. It's the biggest generator of employment, it's the biggest attractor of FDI, it's where the private sector actually thrives, and it is the backbone of competitiveness in any economy. So when we talk about trade, we need to keep in mind that we're talking about trade and services actually is the backbone for any kind of diversification of the economy, particularly if you look at the infrastructure services like telecommunications, finance, transport, energy, the list goes on, and this is not the place to expand on this point, but it is important to keep it in mind, particularly when we talk about any kind of trade cooperation or trade agreement. Finally, and here I won't talk about the third perspective much because this is where the report actually did an excellent job of identifying priorities. Now, the only thing I would say here is that absolutely identify priorities. I have no problem at all with that, but we have to keep in mind that identifying priority does not exclude other potentials, and that those priorities actually would need to be placed into a broader policy and strategic vision, and not to let those priorities define the scope of this project. Now, the final point I would make here before I stop is what have we learned from all this? Because I agree with you, Amjad, that we should be forward-looking. We should be looking at the future. And okay, this is a very exciting opportunity. Now, how can we make sure that this actually translates into something tangible? What we've learned, and we've learned so many things, but I would point at one important thing here, which is that there isn't enough connection between the energy generated by the political will towards this project, as well as other projects regionally, and now unfortunately multilaterally as well. There isn't enough connection between the political will and the political vision and the implementation realities. There is a disconnect there. So what you have being stated as political statements and political will is not what defines what happens on the ground. That disconnect, I think, is something that maybe this report might help bridge for a better future. And with that, let me stop here and apologize for going a bit too long, but I would be more than happy to take questions as they come up. So back to you, Amjad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hamid. I have a lot of follow-up questions, but we'll take them later. I want to give now Russia the floor to give us her perspective, which is as the Egypt author, Egypt's perspective to the agreement. Russia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amjad, and hi, everyone. Thank you very much first for inviting me to co-author this report about a year ago. And then I was really fortunate to have the chance to work with the team on this report. And I think the two key words that you mentioned here, you and Hamid, is the futuristic and a futuristic outlook, and also a pragmatic approach. So my approach when I was thinking about what Egypt would gain from this agreement was by focusing on specific sectors that would be beneficial for both parties, but where Egypt is particularly advantageous.
We've lost
Russia, we lost you.
We lost the voice, not Russia.
I'm here. So let's take a step back. Yes, the three country leaders met at least 3 to 4 times since 2019. So this actually reflects a strong political determination for deepening the level of economic integration between the 3 countries right now. And we all know that there have been multiple attempts for regional integration among Arab states in the past, starting with the Arab Pan-State Project, which was initiated in the 50s, and moving forward to GAFTA, a free trade agreement on services between Arab countries and others. So Egypt alone actually is a signatory member of at least 73 different trade and economic cooperation agreements, and 20 of these are currently active. So let's try to think together, what would make this agreement different? Why do we think that the time is now the right time for a proper agreement to be established and hopefully also to be executed? So for this question, I identified 4 main elements that I'd like to highlight here. So the 3 countries have pressing socioeconomic needs that are driven by a higher than average population growth rate, high levels of poverty and inequality, and a significantly high level of unemployment in the 3 countries, ranging from 11% in Egypt, 15% in Iraq, and close to 20% in Jordan. So there's a clear interest for economic integration. The 3 countries have also suffered the consequences of political instability and conflicts, either directly, such as in Iraq, or through neighboring countries such as in Egypt and Jordan. And the 3 countries are facing together significant global challenges, including climate change. In fact, 5 of the most affected countries in the world to climate change are in the Middle East, and Iraq is unfortunately one of them. Egypt comes also close to that. Egypt is significantly affected by both extreme heat and rising sea levels. So there definitely is common interest and a scope for collaboration, not only on direct economic interests, but also when it comes to policies and acting towards climate change. At the same time, the 3 countries share borders with one another. So Iraq and Jordan, Jordan and Egypt, which makes it very possible to consider joint infrastructure projects linking the 3 countries together. So with this background, I'd like to, like Hamid said, to highlight the potential areas where the agreement should really be focused. And among these, I also speak about services. So service industries are key. They represent about 55% of GDP in Egypt, 62% of GDP in Jordan, and 45% of GDP in Iraq. And again, as Hamid said, this counts for 60 to 70% of global GDP. So service industries are key. FDI is also key, and ironically, FDI registers very low levels in the 3 countries, independently, less than 2% of GDP in each, despite the multiple attempts to improve the private sector dynamics. The focus should also be directed to particular targeted sectors, especially high value added and technology-based sectors. And I'll talk about this in detail shortly. And finally, the scope of the agreement must include sustainability. When I think about the future, I usually think about two words. These are going to be the two words that are going to rule the future: technology and sustainability. If the region is not at the right pace to cope with the new advancements and challenges in these two areas, then the region will definitely lag behind. Now, when I focus on Egypt particularly, I looked at the multiple sectors where Egypt has a clear comparative advantage and where projects can be jointly feasible between the three countries. And I'll highlight at least 4 to 5 of these sectors. So let's pick construction as a start. Egypt has a large and highly efficient and competitive construction industry. In fact, Egypt is leading almost 10% in volume and 17% in value of all construction projects in the Middle East region and Sub-Saharan Africa, which represents about about 80 billion US dollar of investment. Egypt also has experience with exporting construction services that could be particularly relevant for Iraq, within the framework of expanding the country's infrastructure capacity. And the scope of future construction projects that are needed in Iraq range between housing to energy plants to healthcare facilities and others. And at the same time, since construction is a labor-intensive industry, it would be very beneficial to expand investments in this sector. From the Egyptian perspective, it is anticipated that expanding projects into Iraq will generate around 2 million new jobs for Egyptians, in addition, of course, to expected job generation for Iraqi workers as well. The second sector that I've picked is the financial sector. And as Hamid said, this is like a backbone industry that feeds into every other economic industry in any of the three countries. The financial services and the banking industry in Egypt experienced steady growth over the past 30 years due to the continuous regulatory reforms, including the privatization of public sector banks, the consolidation of small banks, etc. And fintech activities have also been on the rise in Egypt. The business startup environment has generally been very vibrant. So this experience is potentially very attractive to both Jordan and Iraq, since the two countries are largely unbanked. In fact, in Iraq, particularly, the financial and banking sector is very underdeveloped, and the Iraqi economy is mostly cash-based. About 60 to 70% of the money supply in Iraq exists in the form of cash. So Egypt could help both Jordan and Iraq expand their financial capabilities through direct investment and also through know-how exchange and capacity building activities between the three central banks. The third sector I'd like to highlight today is telecommunication, so the ICT industry. And we all know that Egypt has had a relatively advanced information and telecommunication industry, which efficiently provides services at low cost. Growth and export rates in the ICT industry in Egypt have been actually very impressive over the past few years, despite the COVID-19 pandemic. So, for example, the ICT sector grew by about 15% in 2020, and ICT export increased from 3.6 billion in 2019 to over 4.2 billion in 2020. So Egypt's ICT capabilities could be very attractive, again, to both countries. And now this is a key sector that is not usually thought about when we think of the context of the Middle East, but I'd really like to put a lot of attention on it, and that's the renewable energy sector. We know that Iraq has ample reserves of oil, but we also know that the future lays in renewables. So the direction should definitely move into this segment. So Egypt is a regional leader in renewable energy, especially in hydroelectric, wind, and solar energy. In fact, Egypt has one of the highest wind speeds in the world, along with Tunisia and Morocco. The Egyptian government has pursued an energy diversification strategy, setting renewable energy targets to about 20% of the electricity mix by 2022, and most of this was met. And the government is also aiming to reach about half of the local demand by 2035. So to date, the country's total installed capacity of renewables amounts to over, close to 4 gigawatts, And Egypt is already exporting electricity and natural gas to Jordan, can also export electricity to Iraq through Jordan. This could be very beneficial for the Iraqi economy since the country is not able to meet its local demand for electricity. And at the same time, Iraq is looking also to diversify its sources of gas and electricity imports, which are currently mostly provided by Iran. So Egypt can help expand the infrastructure base for renewables of wind and solar energy in Jordan, Iraq, through direct projects. Finally, I'll also talk briefly about oil and gas, which could be a strategic sector for the short to the medium term, while really thinking about renewables long term. So currently, Iraq produces significantly more crude oil than it can refine. And I think that with proper infrastructure in place between the three ABC countries, Iraqi crude oil could be shipped through Jordan to Egypt, refined in Egyptian refineries, which currently have a spare capacity, by the way, then it can be used locally or re-exported to Europe or Africa. Or if the Iraqi crude oil exceeds Egypt's refinery capacity, the surplus could be directly shipped to Europe through Egypt for refining and use. So again, I'd like to think of the oil and gas as a short to medium term strategic sector, while these countries are transitioning over the long term to energy, to an renewable energy policy. And then finally, of course, we cannot ignore the political motivation or political will, as has been stated by Hamid, but I actually think that the timing right now is very promising. There are clear political motivations behind the agreement that have been mostly sort of fueled by the changing geopolitical dynamics in the region. And the three countries would definitely have an interest to have one strong economic and political front. However, for the potential of success for this agreement to be maximized, we will need to keep in mind three particular key points. So pragmatic economic gains should be the driving motivation behind this agreement, with focus on trade and services and FDI. Politics come next. The focus should be on future-looking, high-value-added industries such as ICT and fintech. These sectors can create significant spillover effects in terms of employment generation and transfer of know-how. Also, the potential agreement must address the growing challenges facing the region, including these three countries, such as climate change. Therefore, the focus on renewable energy is key, and aligning policies within the scope of climate change and the global SDGs more generally would also be very important. So this is my message. Thank you very much once again. Very much looking forward to answer any questions.
Thank you, Rasha. Ibrahim, I would love to hear Jordan's view, please.
Thank you. Thanks for the Atlantic Council for giving me the opportunity as well to participate and to present the Jordanian view regarding this. I want just to probably reflect on a few things that just have been said, that the ABC agreement, I think it's not an agreement yet in the conventional sense of describing an agreement, because we're just talking. I mean, there is much goodwill, good intention, but I don't see that there is an agreement in that. Generally, I also, Hamid and Rasha probably made my presentation easier because they presented the challenges that their economy, either it's in Iraq or in Egypt, what they're facing in terms of socio-political realities, also the unemployment, the youth, the slowdown in growth, and currently the high rate of inflation, etc. So these are mounting challenges, and unfortunately, they've been exacerbated over the past few months, if not years. And now, when we're talking about this ABC, yes, there is a political will, and that is quite clear, at least in the sense of the regularity of the meetings that takes place at the highest level. And then we should ask the next question is whether and how bureaucracy and how the the stakeholders within each country are looking at this. I will present what we're doing in Jordan, but this initiative, and I agree with Hamid that while sometimes we talk about policy, about integration, about being systematic and the regional geopolitics, but this exercise is more on the transactional side. It's more, I would describe it now as project-based. We are identifying specific projects, and we're identifying why this project is not happening, and then what can be done, and what kind of political support can be extended. And then it's more a private sector-led somehow exercise, as far as I understand it, or as far as I look at it. Because I've been working on this integration, regional integration, for almost 20 years. And unfortunately, we've been talking about the least integrated area in the world, and we talk about all kind of impediment to deepen the regional integration. However, what we have never adopted, with few exceptions, is the project-based approach with governments or politicians extending their support, and the private sector will look into how to execute, how to secure funding for this project, and what is the best modality that can bring together stakeholders within two countries or the three countries in the case we're talking about. So this is, I think, also quite important in that sense. This approach, I think, reflects both the frustrations at the political level and at the private sector level. Politicians, they go, they meet, they shake hands, and they announce that really we want to enhance this cooperation, whether regionally or bilaterally. However, when it comes to the implementation, the private sector is the tool. And as Hamid has sort of described the region, whether it's a private led economy, whether it's a market-led economy, whether it's a mix of both. This we can discuss later, because I don't believe in like this in our, at least in the three countries. I don't believe that it's totally, including Jordan, it's a purely market-led in the sense, despite this relation with the international community. But in a relative sense, maybe the private sector has a more important role in Jordan than in other countries. But now in Egypt, we're witnessing a different dynamics, and Iraq also, this oil-led economy also creating it. So dynamic. So there is a diversity at that level. And this diversity not only in covering the sort of the economic policies adopted, but also the level of development. And that's why when Russia has sort of discussed or presented a project that Egypt can do basically to help Iraq, whether in ICT, whether in services, whether in financial sector, etc., it could be the same actually as far as Jordan is concerned in that level, in that sense. But one simple question, without going deep into history, why all these previous attempts to increase the level of not only trade, investment, labor movement, capital movement, no matter, you know, when you're talking about deep integration, you're talking about probably the investment, the trade and labor, and all kind of aspects related to investment. It wasn't working, it wasn't delivering the desired results, primarily because of not the intention, but because of the practice of whatever we agreed. Even with GAFTA, which is actually a very attractive tool. And I think we talk about also even sub-regional arrangement like Agadir or other form of arrangement that took place previously to enhance sort of regional or sub-regional collaboration. Has never sort of reached or achieved the desired goal. Contrary, trade was growing between this region and Europe or the USA or China on the account of enhancing this bilateral trade. And like the elephant in the room, it's politically, even when we talk about Iraq, we cannot ignore that there are some political certainties that we cannot ignore. I personally would like to talk about a project that it was like a dream for me, being an academic and a researcher, to link the three countries together, which is the Basra, Akaba, Surub pipeline. I attended several meetings at that time in my official capacity. The idea is that it's from Basra to Akaba, and from Akaba, actually, then you are already in Egypt somehow. And I remember we drew the maps and from which point we can do the connection to link to Egypt. So that would have created entirely a different dynamics. However, to execute this project, you really have to have some sort of political consensus with not only between the three countries, but at countries level. Actually, you need also the Iraqis at least to be able to, after the cabinet or the prime minister, the government decides, then they decided that we want to go ahead with this project for some political wrangling and struggle. We could not take practical steps towards executing and introducing and starting implementing that project, which could link the three countries beautifully together in a way. So we have to keep this in mind when we talk about this transaction that we took. Now, taking these certainties and these realities on the ground, we still think that this approach, which is transactional, private-led, and with the political support, we could probably create different dynamics. Although it will take time, but we can at least overcome the non-tariff barriers, the problem that the issues that are facing the investors when they come to Iraq, or from Iraqi investors to come to Jordan or to go to Egypt, or to look at the free market as one block, sub-regional block that can allows for more trade flows. We think in Jordan that giving all of this, Jordan has been developing some industries in Jordan, like pharmaceutical, like textile, etc., which we think also can be create good opportunities even for Iraqi or Egyptian investors to come and place their investment in Jordan, create jobs and promote exports. That's all what these countries, as Russia put it, the desire is, if you to create prosperity, you need to create jobs and you need to enhance exports so you can have space to maneuver in your balance of payment and on your budget. So this is something. Tourism and health tourism in particular also has been identified as a very important sector in Jordan that can also promote and attract some either investment, digitization of the government practices, and which is related to what Russia, the ICT in general, development, software development, etc. It's another area that also we identify in our paper that could be also another venue to collaborate. In the financial sector, already one of the pioneering bank in Iraq today actually is owned by Jordanians, and it's co-owned by Jordanians, of course, but it is proving to be a very good opportunity for those investors to be in the market. And mind you, this is like an initiative taken by the private sector, executed by the private sector, and probably politically it was supported, or at least it has the political coverage that is needed. However, they are now on the ground and they are operating and functioning, which is very good. So this exercise, as Hamid and Rasha and you, Amjad, yourself said, that this is a futuristic. You're looking at the future. You identify opportunities. You identify stakeholders that must be involved in this, and then you try to move from translating these opportunities into a project that would help in enhancing collaboration And I think these opportunities and this specific initiative that somehow in the discussions is being identified, I think can be good. One last thing I want to say, because I'm sort of is that for once the authorities in the three countries, whether at the highest level or at the government, are willing to listen to either the Atlantic Council or the researchers on which opportunities shall we or we can pursue. And normally they are very ignorant, but in this case, at least personally, I felt like they are listening and they are looking on how to make it a success. With this, thank you again for your patience, and I'll be happy to engage in the discussion later on, Amjad. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim, and glad you ended on that positive note. That's refreshing to hear. Barak, if we can just keep it as brief as possible. I'm sorry, but your fellow panelists stole some time, so we want to make sure we leave some questions, but please, the floor is yours for the Iraqi point of view.
Yes, thank you so much, Amjad. I am grateful to the Atlantic Council for giving me this opportunity to participate on this very interesting studies. My approach in assessing the ABC agreement starts with lessons learned from experience done in the past by Iraq in similar cases. Having reviewed and evaluated the many attempts done in this respect since 1957, the outcome was not very encouraging. Even Arab League initiative for partial economic integration in certain sectors via the creation of joint Arab companies and institutions have mostly failed to achieve any progress amid the political tension and instability in the region. All past attempts to unify Arab countries have been motivated by emotional and ideological factors and lacked of solid economic foundation. The new agreement should open new avenues and perspective for real economic cooperation on the short term and economic integration on the long term. However, economic cooperation aimed at gradual integration between Iraq and other Arab countries is highly desirable from Iraq's perspectives. The success of the new agreement, in my opinion, would highly depend on realizing equal economic benefits for all three countries based on a win-win formula and not on a win-lose formula for any country. Furthermore, these benefits should be visible and politically convincing for the population of all three countries, mainly for the Iraqi population. I see many opportunities for the success of this attempt. In my paper, I have identified some good opportunities to initiate effective economic cooperation. From Iraqi perspectives, a good start would be 1 or 2 pilot cooperation projects involving private sector as a first step toward gradual integration in selected sectors. The most important candidate from the Iraqi point of view is the energy sector. In all three countries, and then the agriculture and the tourism sectors. As mentioned from Russia and Ibrahim, there is a good ground for building a sort of integrated oil and gas industry, oil, gas, and electricity industry between the three countries. And this is, in my view, the most promising project. Regarding the trade, I would comment on Hamid's statement. It is true, trading in service could be of benefit for both countries, Egypt and Jordan. But I am not very convinced whether it could be beneficial for Iraq. Definitely, the trade of service, the service sector has a large share in Iraqi GDP, but the service sector is mainly composed of non-tradable industry. That means that is retail, trade, restaurants, hotel, and Iraq exports, non-oil export is very, very low. So Iraq is not able to export any service, but Iraq is importing a lot of service, also importing service for freight and insurance. Furthermore, the financial sector in Iraq, as mentioned by Ibrahim, there is already a Jordanian bank active in Iraq, but no Iraqi banks active in Jordan. From Iraqi perspective, and because of the high unemployment rate in Iraq, investment from Jordanian and Egyptian private sector in Iraq are highly desirable. I would like to remind you that Iraqi investors are very active in Jordan, but no Jordanian investment in Iraq, or very, very few. The unification of oil and gas sector in all three countries, including gas processing and export plants, refineries, and petrochemical industry, would benefit Iraq in diversifying its economy and the partner countries in meeting their increasing needs for energy sources. Iraq's main role would be the provision of crude oil at favorable prices, establishing a custom union between the three countries would allow free trade flows of oil and petrochemical products, and would allow the three countries to protect their energy industry against the competition of other countries. So far, my contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barak. I really appreciate it. We only have 10 minutes, but so please keep your answers as succinct as possible. Hamid, just focusing on the transactional side, the report is very good at presenting transactions, as you said, and programs for common benefit. One issue with all three countries is financing. They would definitely need external financing. And in a world today where you see contraction of global capital, given rising interest rates to the developed world, where do you see the appetite for financing such projects, and what do the three countries have to do to ensure that attractiveness of capital is there?
Well, thank you, Amjad. There are two facets to this question. The first is, how can they exchange financial resources between them? In other words, pool their own financial resources for optimal allocation across the three economies. That's one aspect. The other aspect is how to attract finance from international sources. And I think on the first, which is pooling financing across the three countries, here the transactional approach actually could go very far in collaborating to create a vision for how financial resources can actually be optimally allocated across the three economies. With respect to attracting finance from the rest of the world, whether it's private sector globally or from international financial institutions, here I think the three countries would do themselves a huge favor if they reinforce their attractiveness as destinations for FDI. And there's a long agenda there. This is not the time or place to get into it, but this is key, particularly today, with all the financial challenges that the world is facing, post-pandemic, time of war, rising interest rates. That requires a different kind of a radar screen to look at. So I would look at it in these two perspectives, but the transactional part for the first facet of it, I think, can go very far, given the kind of direct approaches that have been articulated just by Barak, Russia, and Ibrahim. So back to you, Amjad.
I'm glad you mentioned that last point, because I think people forget that part of regional integration, actually a big part of it, is reducing your own barriers yourself. So a lot of it is in your own hands. And I think increasing your attractiveness is key to the success of this agreement. Russia, we've heard energy multiple times. And I think it seems like the obvious one. You mentioned it as renewables, but also you mentioned existing oil and gas. Going to Ibrahim's pet project, and Barak mentioned it as well, focusing on oil and gas itself in the immediate term. How do you view that project from Egypt's point of view, and what can Egypt's participation in that look like?
Sure, thank you, Amjad. I think, so going back to oil and gas, I would, Egypt is already exporting gas to both countries, I guess mostly to Jordan, but probably also to Iraq. And I think the idea of using the crude oil from Iraq, refining it in Egypt, working on enhancing the refinery capacity in Egypt, re-exporting is key, by the way. So in the meantime, Egypt can really gain a lot by working on advancing its technology in terms of storage. So storage and re-export facilities, whether in the oil and gas, so traditional hydrocarbon, or in the renewable energy sector also. In fact, in renewables, Egypt is expected to exceed its own targets, and it would be very beneficial if the storage facility and capacity is present so that Egypt can use the extra capacity to re-export to these markets and also to the world. And as Hamid mentioned, we need to think of flowing investments as a multi-dimensional tool, because there are cross-country investments that would be generated by removing barriers within the three countries, but also by creating this bigger market of 150 million people, 500 billion GDP, in virtue of a bigger market size, you also attract investment from outside the region. So this is also key. And this is definitely valid in both oil and gas and also renewables.
Ibrahim, is there a role here for the US and Europe, specifically with the energy project? Do you think they can be a good influence and help this project along?
Sure. Even in the last point that Russia mentioned, in terms of like excess energy on to excess electricity, either from renewable or others, because also in Jordan we could do. There are like, and I can talk about specifics since we're talking about project that already like to do the connection from Jordan to Iraq. That the part of the project to be completed in Iraq is already funded by the US actually. And I know that there's like the last 70 kilo from the last point where there is connectivity to the borders is already either it's procured or it's under execution. And I remember last time I was in Baghdad, we were talking about this project. So yes, definitely this is something physically on the ground can be done, but in terms of also facilitating this trade flows, having like collaterally cumulative value added between the three countries to access the US market or the EU market for that matter, and to help even the politics of facilitating this project, definitely there is a big room actually, because while these three governments are working together, and obviously you need to sort of make it happen in terms of the logistics, in terms of even securing the funding, which you're asked about and how it can be done. Although I have a comment on this, is that it's not lack of fund actually that is inhibiting this project. There's a lot of fund available, and if we just think about private sector led, there are so many different funding modalities that can be created in order for this project to be executed.
Barak, I want to give you the last word on the energy opportunity. What is Iraq's perspective? Is this something that would be high on the list? And how do you feel about being able to execute that type of project? Oh, you're muted.
Yes. Yes. Well, I have already suggested establishing investment funds to finance joint investment between the private sector of all three countries. As energy projects are require a big amount of investment, it is recommended to establish a joint company for refinery and petrochemical using the Iraqi crude. And the location could be in Jordan and in Egypt. But very important from Iraqi perspective, this should be a joint investment project, not just exporting oil to Jordan and Egypt, and they invest alone or they process the oil and export it. It should be similar to the experience of the European Union. They established at first a bloc or a union of the steel and coal industry with trade custom area, free trade custom area for this industry, and to protect their industry from foreign competition. So the European aimed at trading between each other, but finally exporting their product to the outside world. And this model should be served for Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt.
Correct. Yeah, and I think the report does a great job of outlining several of these interesting projects. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but this is really the beginning of a discussion, not the end. So we will be having more of these on the report, and be on the lookout for the report. It will be released on September 22nd. We will send it to all who registered for this event and to our wider newsletter. So please subscribe. Thank you to the distinguished panelists. The report is excellent and can't wait to put it out for everyone else to read. And thank you for joining us today. Appreciate your time and appreciate your valuable comments.
Thank you, Amjad. Thanks for all.
Thank you, Amjad, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Until next time.